What business am I in as a ransomware gang? I'm not in the business of ransomware. I'm in the business of extortion. And extortion only requires one thing to work, which is leverage. And leverage takes the form these days of information that's threatened to be leaked if you don't pay the ransom. So notice how the concept of supply chain, get one thing to get to many things and many customers beyond, applies really well to the criminal ecosphere. Hi, Scott Shefferman here, Principal Cyber Strategist at Eclypsium. Today I want to ask a very simple question with a not so simple answer. What is a supply chain attack? Now notice I said attack. So we're not here today to talk about kind of traditional notions of solving the supply chain problem, where you have upstream component providers and you have design phase, production phase, and all the way down to distribution, warehousing, and final delivery of the product you take in, whereupon you verify your bill of materials and you know via signed hashes that this thing is the thing I intended to buy. It's not counterfeit. It doesn't have backdoors and bugs, I hope, because it's signed and I trust my upstream. No, that's not the conversation for today. It's a very important problem. And even Eclypsium are working diligently, like with NIST and a CCOE consortium of other vendors, to solve that exact problem. But today we're actually here to talk about a different thing, which is a supply chain attack in the context of what you read about in the news, it seems, on the daily. And I'll preface this by saying, I don't really care what we call this thing I'm about to describe, but it's definitely a thing. And it definitely needs to be addressed head on and on purpose by enterprises if they hope to get ahead of what they read about and they're experiencing. Okay, so supply chain attack today looks a little bit different from what I was describing just earlier. It's much more about an adversary, whether it's a nation state or nation-backed adversary, or it's a criminal adversary. Either way, it's much more about those entities realizing that they can go after one thing to get to many things. I hate to oversimplify it too much, but there it is. I want to get to one organization so I can get to their customers, their partners. Okay, so what do we want to call this thing? You tell me, because I like to call it a supply chain attack. I like to say that when APT5, or otherwise known as the Russian SVR, the same ones that are in the news very recently, we're having targeted 5 specific CVEs in the joint report that NSA, FBI, and CISA put out. 3 of those 5 CVEs are ones that have to do with externally facing VPN appliances. So vulnerabilities in the firmware of those appliances that are externally facing. I don't need to mention their names here. It's not about the vendor names, because I'll tell you what, I don't know a single VPN provider manufacturer in the last 2 years that hasn't had some major CVE, remote code execution kind of vulnerability associated with it. As I'm talking to you right now, I'm looking at a new one that just popped up right now. Okay, so forget the names, focus on the concept. On any given Sunday, there are attackers that are going after these devices, not because I'm trying to target an organization that has this device and I do my research on this device and I find a vulnerability and I say, oh, I might be able to write an exploit for that vulnerability. No, that's so 1996, guys. This is different. This is saying I'm going after the OEM. I'm going to reverse and understand their firmware, that device operating system as best as I can. And when I find vulnerabilities, I'm going to then use a tool like Shodan to mass scan, whatever, to find these vulnerabilities. And then I'm going to figure out I'm going to prioritize which of these potential victims I'd like to compromise. And I'm going to go from there. And in my mind, I have an idea. I want to go after the defense industrial base, after the FIN space, after the EDU space, after the medical research space, or the COVID vaccine research space, whatever it is. But the mechanism, the strategy, if you will, that you're using as an adversary is to go after one thing to get to many. So was the Eclypsium FTA campaign performed by TA505 or CLOP, was that a supply chain attack or not? Well, the press certainly called it that. And in large part, they did that because they figured that whomever whatever organization was able to reverse that device firmware sufficiently enough to find those chainable RCEs, put enough time and effort into it where they were specifically targeting that manufacturer and device in order to do what? To target that device's customer base. But what's interesting about Eclypsium, the FDA device, it's a large file transfer device. It sits on the internet, serving up and receiving large files. Those of whom? The victim's customers and the victim's partners. In other words, it's a multi-tiered supply chain attack that the CLOP ransomware gang had in mind. Now notice, they're a ransomware gang. They're named after their own ransomware called CLOP. They discarded that to go a much easier, more powerful route. They probably, I don't know this, purchased somehow or got a hold of the remote code execution vulnerability chain in these devices and realized, if I pop this one organization, I get all their customers. I pop this other organization, I get all their customers. What business am I in as a ransomware gang? I'm not in the business of ransomware. I'm in the business of extortion. And extortion only requires one thing to work, which is leverage. And leverage takes the form these days of information that's threatened to be leaked if you don't pay the ransom. So notice how the concept of supply chain, get one thing to get to many things and many customers beyond, applies really well to the criminal ecosphere. But it also applies extremely well to nation state adversaries. Also always in the news these days, the Russian group, the APT5, as FireEye calls them, or the SVR. This version of adversary is well-versed in targeting single points of failure to get to many victims. That's why the FBI, the FBI, CISA, and NSA put out a joint report on the 5 CVEs that they're targeting. And 3 of those 5, in fact, were externally facing VPN appliances that had these single points of vulnerability failure that allowed that organization with few resources to compromise many victims in the defense industrial base and elsewhere. Same thing is playing out today with the Pulse Secure, these days with like the Pulse Secure vulnerabilities. The most recent one is a 0-day that at the time I'm delivering this has not yet been patched and won't be for another several weeks. But it's being actively exploited in the wild, okay? And this is being done most likely by Chinese actors, most likely APT5, nation state backed actors. But they've realized too that if I hit a Pulse Secure device and I chain perhaps a RCE vulnerability with whatever the 0-day is, I can do crazy things with persistence and survive even reboots or patching. That's the current status as I deliver this, right? There's another one, Sonic Wall came up today when I'm giving this, right? 3 vulnerabilities, RCEs in the wild being exploited. These are not happenstance. These are not targeted attacks in the sense that they're targeting one organization because you know they have whatever, a Sonic Wall or Pulse or Citrix ADC or Big 5, F5 big IP device, whatever it is, du jour. It's not, that's not how it's working. It's working by targeting the organization, targeting the vendor product, and then going after all of their downstream customers, right? So I'm here to say that supply chain attacks are not what we have been thinking of them in the last 15, 20 years. And perhaps that's why we've all been kind of caught off guard, to put it quite frankly. If you look at what an organization needs to do to actually get ahead of these kind of attacks, well, the rubber meets the road inside your operational environment. None of this matters to you until you have an externally facing device, let's say, that has an RCE vulnerability that it comes up on day 0. And you have X amount of time to get ahead of the adversary that might take advantage of it. I'll go so far as to say that the recent Microsoft Exchange attacks on tens of thousands of victims are a great example of this type of supply chain attack. They're almost so phenomenal, we hesitate to call it a supply chain attack because you get one vendor, one product, and you get tens or 100,000 plus victims, potential victims, right, that you get to go after at that point, right? And at that point, you pick and choose what you want, whether you're nation state or criminal, because both went after those exchange vaults, right? So, all right, so what do you do about it? Well, the first thing you need to do is realize the same thing that's true of almost any cybersecurity problem. You first need actual visibility. And by actual visibility, I mean a centralized way to know all of your enterprise devices and their status, and whether or not they've been baselined, whether or not they've been analyzed at the component and subcomponent level, whether or not they're up to date on their firmware and their device OS, right? If you don't even have that, then what happens when, I don't know, somebody on the board of the directors reads a headline and pings the CISO, and it says, are we protected? Are we exposed? Do we have one of these devices, these things like a pulse secure device or whatever? And now the CISO is left with a question mark. Do I call it NetSecOps? Do I have a pulse secure device I may not be aware of, managed by some other third party or partner that I have a connection with? Did my normal vulnerability management team that runs things like Nessus or Qualys scans or whatever do a scan in the last week or month, and did they find a vulnerability on a device by looking at it? Like, these are not the answers you need. You actually need deeper analysis of a device and the ability to see the component and subcomponent level. You need to be able to analyze, let's say on an x86 box, you need to be able to actually look at the firmware and say, this is in fact the thing it says it is, right? Through actual static heuristic analysis, not just it says it's the right version. After all, if you're an adversary and you occupy sub-kernel or sub-ring 0 space, wouldn't you also advertise that you're up to date with the latest version? This plays out all the time, by the way. So in the enterprise space, what you need to do first is gain visibility. And I really do emphasize and stress that it should be independent visibility, meaning you shouldn't rely on the OEM vendor that you're worried about and their security and their supply chain and their SecOps and their threat profile in the face of all these attacks we read about in the news. Don't rely on that apparatus to tell you that that device is up to date and secure, right? And has X or Y or Z vulnerabilities. No, do that yourself, so to speak, via an independent platform from all that vendor space, right? That's kind of blocking and tackling basics. One of the biggest problems that enterprises run into is they're putting the fox in the hen house against a backdrop of everything everybody's reading about in the news, about all these vendors having massive vulnerabilities and supply chain issues. Okay, so start there. And after you have that, and you have that visibility we just spoke of, then you want some kind of intelligence, right, to tell you which ones you need to prioritize first against your mission or your operational cadence or your planned downtime windows in an OT environment, whatever it is. You need to know which ones to prioritize. And that information should be based on the severity of a vulnerability and whether it's being used in the wild and how it might tie to a MITRE attack matrix that aligns to the threat modeling that you've done for your organization, right? It should be not unlike the stuff we do above ring 0 on x86 platforms, right? In OS and application land, right? So prioritize accordingly, and then baseline, and then know that over time, as a device has a lifespan, and from beginning to all the way to sunset, that lifespan is monitored continuously to know if you have a drift. So let's say you have 5,000 devices, all of the same model, and they start on day 0 as the same device at that firmware component level. But on day 65, arbitrary day, 5 of those devices have a subcomponent that shifts its integrity. Why did that happen? It should not happen. Not unless you made it happen. But you'll know that if you have a centralized platform, won't you? Whether or not you initiated those kind of updates. So this is really the mission and the vision of what Eclypsium is as an organization, but more importantly, as an enterprise-grade platform with all the integrations you would ever ask for that go to all of your SIM and Splunk or anything else you're doing on an integration level that you'd want to do. If you want a high confidence alert coming from device holistic firmware, platform foundational level, you want to pivot off of that, do it. Conversely, if you get a malware infection and that malware has already known to go to things like the BIOS and the UEFI, then you want to do some forensics on that device at the firmware level, don't you? Rather than putting it right back into a contested environment during a containment and eradication phase in IR. So there are ways for organizations, especially enterprises that struggle with this dynamic, to actually get better fast. If you did this without an automated intelligent platform that could do all the things and have a single dash, it would take a lot of effort and a lot of human capital that you probably can't find and hire and retain ever, and you'll never get ahead of it because of the volume and the diversity of that ecosphere at the device level. So that's why our customers, enterprise grade clients, love what we do, is because it's automating it for them. It's putting it in their hands. It's giving them that dash. It's giving that baseline. They now have metrics that they can report back. They can now actually register risk on the enterprise risk register itself and articulate that to stakeholders and board. And going into mergers and acquisitions, it's valuable to say, I know my environment is uncontested, doesn't have backdoors and implants via supply chain and actors, right, that came into their malware. So these things are very valuable to enterprises, and it's why the platform is built the way it is. It's why our customers love us. And without further ado, I'll leave it at that and say, if you want to solve the real world supply chain attack problem, this is how you do it.